Good day everyone. Today I and a few mates have produced this documentary about the creation and production of tanks from the early days of World War II. Now, some of you may not know what a tank is. Well, never fear, as I am quite the tank enthusiast, therefore I shall indulge in educating you. The very first successful tank design was actually made in 1915 during the First World War. The name tank was used as a codename to trick any nosy German spies from discovering the Lancia project. This involved creating the world's first ever tank design titled Little Willie. Now I know some of you might find the name quite silly, but let me tell you, Little Willie's creation was the main reason behind Germans being more scared than ever going onto the front lines, hearing the sounds of tracked machinery and steel approaching them in the trenches. Put yourself in the shoes of a German soldier going into the front lines and seeing 28 tons of steel rolling at you at 6 kilometers an hour across no man's land. Quite scary, isn't it? Now, for its time, Little Willie was quite innovative, but some of you may also think, what are the main purposes of these tanks? Well, the main purpose of these tanks were to break through enemy lines and allow infantry to breach the trenches. However, due to how new tanks were, they suffered many logistical problems like being bogged in mud, crew members inhaling toxic engine fumes, and worst of all, being struck by artillery. Now, for Little Willie, he had no guns and was quite underwhelming, very accurate to its name. But this would later be improved on by the British military producing the first actual tank for war, which was called the Mark I. Now, the Mark I was definitely an improvement from Little Willie, yet it still suffered the same flaws as before. Over the course of the war, the Mark I would be improved on, later becoming the Mark V, and by then other countries such as France and even Germany had tried on their own to make their own tanks. France made their Renault FT and the Saint Chamond, while Germany tried to make their own, but spoiler alert, they could not make enough. But roughly around 10 units that were called A7V were created, with only one original still intact today, which is Mephisto, which funnily enough, we took as a war trophy. Yes, that's right, the Australian Army took this hunk of steel as a war trophy. Oh, and how could I forget the Russians? Since Russia were having issues of their own, they pulled out of the war rather early. However, they also tried on their own to create a tank, this tank being named the Star Tank, named after the star Nicholas. This tank was actually very terrible in design choices. You can probably guess why. Now, after the surrender of Germany and entering the interwar period, tanks were studied further in case of any other future conflicts, foreshadowing things like the Vickers Medium Mark I being produced and tested. And to be real with you, these tanks were flawed, and thankfully the Brits learned from their mistakes. These lessons included adding a functional turret that revolves a new technology like electricity suspension, which actually caught the eye of the Soviet Union. Now, these fellas saw the technology of electricity suspension and saw an opportunity, which led to the creation of the BT-2 and 5. During the uprising of Adolf Hitler himself, he had many ways of creating loopholes in the Treaty of Versailles, allowing him into designing and producing tanks for the Wehrmacht. This was done by naming prototype tanks as farming supplies like Tractor. With the help of collaborating with the Soviet Union in 1926, they had created a secret tank school in Kazan, which is named Kazan Tank School, which allowed German and Soviet engineers to design tanks under secrecy, without issues. Also, since tanks were still fairly new, German tanks were created to be light and fast, which would be useful in the strategy of blitzkrieg. Most, if not all, Nazi German tanks were called Panzers, or Panzerkampfwagen, which is quite a mouthful to say. Moving on, the word Panzerkampfwagen usually meant armored fighting vehicle, with the earliest model being the Panzer I, which is mainly used as a training vehicle but saw service in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, but was handed over to China's Second Sino-Japanese War and mainly used in the invasion of Poland. Now, since the Panzer I was somewhat a success, the design was improved on with the Panzer II, which featured an early autocannon, and later becoming the Panzer III, which featured a 50mm cannon. Now, let's talk about Australia, specifically Australian tank designs. Now, since Australia and Great Britain are good mates, Australia was given tanks produced from the Brits. These tanks included the Matilda II, the Vickers light tank, and the unique M3 Grant. These designs were still rather new and still had some design principles similar to the Mark V, with the M3 Grant having 2 cannons, which on paper sounds beneficial when in reality it was a logistical nightmare. Further on in the war, Australia had actually designed their own tank in 1941, believe it or not. This tank being named the Sentinel, which is a cruiser tank, made just in case the imminent threat of Japan were to come around and attack us. Now, it was Australia's first time designing a tank, so it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for the Australian Army to accept into service, as it was better than nothing. In North Africa, Australian troops had also gotten their hands on Italian M11 tanks, which weren't that great, seeing as Italy was somewhat underpowered in military strength and production. Going back at the more deep parts of tank history, Germany had created the Panzer IV and the most vehicle yet in 1942, the Tiger 1. Now, the Tiger 1 is regarded as the most iconic tank of the war due to how advanced it was for its time. It is a heavy tank armed with an 88mm cannon and 100mm of frontal armor, making it rather difficult for the allied tanks such as the M4A2 Sherman to punch through all that armor. However, the Tiger 1 would come with drawbacks such as the drivetrain breaking down from its heavy weight. Since the introduction of the Tiger, Allied forces such as Britain upgraded the Sherman with a 17-pounder gun, naming it Sherman Firefly, which had a gun capable of destroying the Tiger 1 from the front. Not only that, but their main design philosophy in Nazi Germany was quality over quantity, while Allied forces focused on quantity over quality, which proved to overwhelm the German Art Division later on in the war. Now, over in Italy and Japan, they also want to try making their tank designs. However, their designs were arguably terrible. One prime example from Italy is the L3, which is classified as a tankette. Now, this little baby tank was pretty much harmless compared to what Germany, USSR, USA, and Britain could make. Now yes, it is still a tank, but very terrible in tank-on-tank combat due to how small and weak it was in firepower and armor. This was mostly due to Italy making their tanks light enough to traverse the mountainous terrain of Italy, although they were mainly fighting in Africa. You could definitely tell Mussolini was not that great at understanding tank design, as well as Hitler. Well, at least Hitler's tanks actually worked somewhat better. Now, the Japs also wanted in on making their own great beautiful machines of war. Spoiler alert, once again, they did not know what the hell they were doing. Yes, they did borrow some foreign tanks like the Mark 6 and medium Mark 8 Whippets, but at the time they were lacking capability in tank mass production or designing. Now, enough about imported tanks, let's talk about what Japan actually produced from their intense studying of tank design. When Japan started making their tanks, they were really lacking in steel supply. Why? Well, yeah, you can probably guess why again. Majority of the adoption of tank design was based off French designs, but after the defeat with the Soviets in Omaha in 1939, they switched up the strategy focusing on infantry support, but with the start of the Pacific War, production moved on to Navy vessels and the Air Force. The history of tanks is one that played a major role in the future of warfare. From one tractor thing in no man's land, to tanks that have boilers for tea, tanks that were rather impractical and based on fantasy, to creating a design constraint called the Iron Triangle. The design history of tanks, landships, panzers, and steel coffins all influenced the way warfare worked. Tanks in their prime were used more often, but eventually as technology adapted with anti-tank weapon production, tanks fell more into a rare support role. While yes, they are still used, though they are used less often because of urban warfare. Thank you all for watching. I hope I have given you some knowledge you may pass on to your friends and family. Whether you found this interesting or not, I hope you learned something. Now, excuse me, I have some important business to attend to.